Egypt, the land of the Nile, a civilization so ancient its origins feel like myth. Known for its towering pyramids, intricate hieroglyphs, and a legacy that shaped the course of human history. But here's a question we rarely ask. Why do we so often talk about ancient Egypt as if it isn't African? Furthermore, why is there such an effort to disassociate ancient Egypt from Africa when it continues to identify itself as African? This isn't just a historical oversight, it's a damaging narrative with profound consequences. In this video, we'll explore how Egypt was slowly detached from its African identity, what that detachment did to the African psyche, and why reclaiming Egypt's African heritage is essential not just for history, but for the spiritual and cultural renewal of an entire continent. To understand how Egypt lost its African identity, we must first recognize its deep roots within the continent. Ancient Egypt was not merely a land of towering monuments and grand architecture. It was a distinctly African civilization. Its foundation was deeply intertwined with the spiritual beliefs and cultural practices that shaped countless other African empires. Egypt's identity was, at its core, a reflection of the continent's rich and diverse traditions. The continuity when comparing ancient Egypt to other African cultures speaks to its kinship. Their love for gold is reminiscent of the Ashanti Kingdom or the wealthy and great Mali Empire. Their spiritual system, Ma'at, whose central principles include truth, balance, and harmony, had a pantheon that included a vast array of gods and goddesses, each associated with natural elements and societal functions. There was Ra, the sun god, Isis, the goddess of motherhood, and Osiris, lord of the afterlife, to name a few. In addition to its many deities, many Egyptian texts also reference a single, overarching creator god, Amen, the source of all. This philosophy didn't exist in isolation. Across Africa, we see echoes of this concept. The Zulu, the Yoruba, and the Bantu kingdoms all sharing this sentiment. The Egyptians placed great emphasis on life after death, as evidenced by elaborate burial rituals, the construction of pyramids and tombs, and texts like the Book of the Dead, which provided instructions for navigating the afterlife. Similarly, many African societies believe in an afterlife where the soul continues to exist. The Ashanti, for example, believe that the soul journeys to the land of the ancestors. Rituals are performed, even today, to ensure safe passage and integration into the spiritual world. To the unbiased eye, it is clear to see that ancient Egypt shares more than just customs with its African counterparts. Egypt's art, religion, and philosophy reflected the continent's diversity. They're bound together by a common spiritual ecosystem, one that's uniquely African and hard to find beyond the continent. Egypt's separation from the rest of Africa began over 2,500 years ago with the arrival of foreign powers. The Persians were the first to conquer Egypt in 525 BCE, followed by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. The Roman Empire was profoundly influenced by Egypt, particularly in religion, architecture, and governance. The Romans adopted Egyptian gods like Isis and Osiris, incorporating them into their own religious practices. The cult of Serapis, a fusion of Egyptian and Greek deities, spread widely across Rome. Roman architecture also borrowed from Egypt, particularly the use of obelisks and monumental columns. Alexander the Great, during his conquest of Egypt, embraced Egyptian religious and cultural practices. Crowned pharaoh in 332 BCE, he symbolized the merging of Greek and Egyptian traditions. His reign marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period, where Greek culture blended with Egyptian beliefs, especially in Alexandria, which became a global center of learning. Scholars in Alexandria, such as those in the Library of Alexandria, studied Egyptian sciences, including astronomy and medicine. Greek philosophers, including Pythagoras and Plato, also studied in Egypt, deeply influenced by its intellectual and spiritual traditions. Pythagoras is said to have spent time in Egypt, where he learned mathematical and mystical teachings that would shape his own philosophy. Similarly, Plato was introduced to Egyptian wisdom, particularly on the nature of the soul and the afterlife, during his travels there. However, both philosophers framed their learning within the context of Greek intellectual tradition, often downplaying their Egyptian influences in favor of promoting Greek thought. The Romans, following Alexander's example, adopted the idea of divine kingship, where emperors were seen not only as rulers, but also as gods, mirroring the pharaohs of Egypt. Emperors such as Augustus and Caligula embraced Egyptian royal symbols and titles to reinforce their divine status. In these ways, Egypt's influence on Rome and Greek thought was profound, shaping religious, philosophical, architectural, and political practices. Alexander's encounter with Egypt, along with the philosophical exchanges between Egypt and Greek scholars, laid the foundation for a lasting cultural fusion. As Egypt became a hub of Mediterranean trade and governance, its ties to sub-Saharan Africa grew weaker. The Arab invasion of Egypt in the 7th century AD marked a profound moment in the history of Egypt and its African identity. The invasion, led by Omar ibn al-As in 640 AD, brought not just military conquest, but a transformation of Egypt's religious and cultural landscape. Before the Arabs arrived, Egypt had long been the spiritual heart of Africa, with ancient beliefs rooted in polytheism, followed by the spread of Christianity. The advent of Islam from the Arab conquerors shifted Egypt's identity. Islam, with its monotheistic focus, gradually replaced Egypt's ancient traditions. Temples dedicated to Egyptian gods were destroyed, and many Egyptians converted to Islam, either by choice or through pressure from their new rulers. The ancient Egyptian religious system, once flourishing with deities like Ra, Osiris, and Isis, was gradually displaced. This religious shift had deep spiritual and psychological effects on the Egyptians. For millennia, they had seen their identity tied to the gods, the pharaohs, and their complex understanding of the afterlife. With the Arab invasion, this worldview was overthrown, replaced by the Islamic understanding of the divine. The arrival of Islam and the subsequent Arabic language and culture undermined the traditional Egyptian way of life, leaving many struggling with the loss of their ancient heritage. The change wasn't just cultural, it was psychological. The Egyptians, whose deep spiritual ties had been to their ancient traditions, were now living under a foreign belief system that viewed their ancestral practices as outdated or pagan. This left a sense of spiritual dislocation, and the loss of Egypt's previous religious and cultural dominance created a psychological rift within the people. Their connection to their past was severed, and their once great civilization became absorbed into a new foreign order. Despite the gradual disappearance of ancient Egyptian religious practices, traces of this heritage persisted. Egyptian symbols, such as the Ankh and Eye of Horus, continue to appear in folk art and Islamic mysticism. However, the full integration of Egypt into the Arab and Islamic world transformed its identity. The once proud African heritage of Egypt, long recognized as the cradle of African civilization, was now overshadowed by its Arab Muslim identity. This shift altered how Egypt, and by extension Africa, began to view itself, with Egypt no longer seen as a solely African civilization, but as part of a larger Arab and Islamic world. The arrival of European colonial powers in Africa in the late 19th century marked a profound shift in the continent's identity. During this time, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 carved Africa into colonial territories without regard for the existing cultures and peoples, setting the stage for decades of exploitation. Beyond the territorial division, colonization brought with it an assault on Africa's spiritual and cultural heritage. One of the most significant losses during this period was the systematic removal of ancient Egyptian artifacts. Egypt, once the heart of African civilization, was plundered for its religious relics, including statues, mummies, and sacred texts. These items were taken to Europe, often displayed in museums as symbols of European dominance over African culture. This looting not only stripped Egypt of its material heritage, but also undermined its spiritual significance. The pyramids, temples, and the knowledge encoded in Egyptian symbols and architecture were now seen through a foreign lens, disconnected from the African context in which they were created. The removal of these artifacts helped further distort African history and spirituality. For centuries, European powers framed ancient Egypt as a product of European genius, despite its clear African origins. By disconnecting Egypt from the rest of Africa, they presented the notion that Africa had no significant history or civilization. This narrative was used to justify colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, perpetuating the idea that Africans were primitive and needed to be civilized. The impact of this distortion on the African psyche was deep. Many Africans were led to believe that their own spiritual systems, cultures, and contributions to world history were inferior. Ancient Egyptian religious practices, which had been foundational to African spirituality, were dismissed as ancient and irrelevant. As a result, when Christianity and Islam were introduced by colonizers, they were often imposed as superior belief systems, causing Africans to abandon their indigenous religions and spiritual practices. Colonialism not only reshaped the physical landscape of Africa, but also eroded its collective memory. African identity, once grounded in the spiritual and cultural wealth of ancient Egypt, was disrupted by a foreign narrative that glorified European civilization while erasing Africa's achievements. The African connection to the ancient spiritual and philosophical traditions of Egypt, which had once shaped the continent, was severed, leaving a psychological void that lasted for generations. Despite these challenges, African people have always resisted this erasure. As African nations gained independence, there was a resurgence of pride in African heritage, including a renewed interest in reconnecting with the ancient wisdom of Egypt. However, the colonial legacy continues to influence African identity today, with artificial borders, historical distortions, and psychological scars still affecting the continent's sense of self and its relationship to its ancient past. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth, even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Deuteronomy 28:64, KJV. These narratives had devastating consequences for Africa's psyche. By severing Egypt from Africa, colonial and Arab-centric history stripped Africans of their connection to one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Spiritually, the effects were just as profound. Traditional African religions, once vibrant and diverse, were dismissed as pagan or primitive. Colonization and Arabization imposed new religions and cultural systems, often erasing indigenous practices entirely. This spiritual disconnection created what some call a crisis of identity. When Africans are told that their history is either non-existent or not theirs to claim, it leaves a void, a deep wound in the collective consciousness. But this story isn't just about loss. Today, Africans in the diaspora are reclaiming Egypt as part of their heritage. Scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop have proven that Egypt's roots are undeniably African. Movements across the continent are challenging colonial and Arab-centric narratives, bringing Egypt back into the African fold. This reclamation is about more than history. It's about healing the psychological wounds of colonialism and Arabization. By reconnecting with Egypt, Africans rediscover a legacy of innovation, spirituality, and resilience that can inspire a brighter future. These strides aren't exclusive to Egypt. Africans across the globe have pushing relentlessly for European countries to return ancestral artifacts. In addition to this, they continue to correct the damaging inaccuracies with a view for spiritual and psychological healing. The longing to reconnect is evident and in keeping of Africa's original spiritual systems. In order to understand your future, you must piece together the past, or simply put in true to Mod. One must know thyself.